All right, just setting everything up. We'll wait a few minutes for more people to log in. And then we will get down to our study. Hope everybody's having a good day. A reminder, if your Jewish calendar did not update you earlier, last night and today we are commemorating Yom Hazikaron, which is the day of remembrance in Israel for those that have fallen in her wars, as well as victims of terror. Although our topic, unfortunately, does not have any direct application, the study of Torah in the memory of others is always considered to be a worthwhile thing. We are studying in their honor because their sacrifice has continued. This discussion of the condition of tzara'at shouldn't come as a surprise. Before we jump into the specifics of tzara'at that we will be examining this day and this year, I just want to give a reminder. You can go back through my old videos and see this in many more detail. Tzara'at is often defined as leprosy or leprous affliction. That is because the word tzara'at was used to describe the medical condition of leprosy that we recognize as leprosy by its biology in the modern world. But it was also used to describe this very different affliction, problem. Now, tzara'at can manifest itself in people's skin. It can also manifest itself as an understanding of biology. Even in the ancient world, they knew what the basic framework of disease was, even if they didn't have germ theory or other ideas of the body's workings. That we're going to talk about the mechanics first, and then we're going to, in our commentary, talk more about the details of what that means and how we reflect upon it. So let's deal with the Torah's discussion of this straight up, and then we will go into our commentary first to see how this is understood in its technical terms, and then how it is understood in the broader sense. So we are in Vayikra 13, Leviticus chapter 13, beginning with verse 47. When an eruptive affection occurs in a cloth of wool or linen fabric, in the warp or in the woof of the linen or the wool, or in a skin or in anything made of skin. Here we're talking about hide, leather, if you will. That is an additional form of cloth or clothing. Verse 49. If the affection in the cloth or the skin, in the warp or the woof, or in any article of skin is streaky green or red, it is an eruptive affection. It shall be shown to the priest. Now, before we continue with the priestly examination, I just want to point out the awkwardness with which this translation has tried to deal with what's going on here. If you were to go back further up in the text, where's my mouse? There we are. If you go back up further in the thing, we can see that this is called leprous, right? And that's the term that is used throughout the entire text to refer to tzara'at, is leprosy. However, when we come down to verse 47, where it is happening in something that is an inanimate object, the Hebrew still calls it a negat tzara'at. It's still a tzara'at affliction or eruption, visible sign, symptom. That's a good English word. But the translation no longer wants to call it leprous. Why? Because the translation knows that leprosy is not something that your shirt can get. That's not how leprosy works. So they deliberately changed the translation in order to avoid the incongruity in the English of calling the affliction of an inanimate object leprosy. However, as you probably got from my preamble, that confuses the topic. Now it makes it look like the human version is run-of-the-mill leprosy and the inanimate is something completely different, when in fact, all of them are completely different from what is run-of-the-mill leprosy. So just how subtle translations can not explicitly show you what they are doing. Sometimes they are making these decisions to make it easier to read, but these questions should be coming up when we reach difficult passages. And you should be saying, wait a minute, cloth can't become leprous, so this must be something different, and that would help you revise how you understood the first half of the chapter. The grace with which the translator avoided that problem means you avoided that insult, which is why I'm taking the time to explain it. Doesn't mean it's a bad translation, but it does mean that you have to be very careful when reading through translations. Okay, so we've got this tzara'at that is now showing up in cloth made of wool or linen, or that is made up of hide, of leather of some variety. Warp and woof, for those of you out there who don't have a loom sitting in your house, warp and woof is referring to the cross weave and the vertical weave on different, when you are making fabric. Most of us, are wearing fabric that is so tightly woven of such fine but strong thread that you can barely see the over-under way that the fabric has been made. Of course, back in the day, everything would have been home woven, and therefore it would have been much more obvious. And they're trying to say that it doesn't matter in which way it is showing up. If it's a problem, if it's there, it's a problem that needs to be dealt with. Okay. And as you can see in this particular case, the coloration that is being looked for is some form of streaky green or some form of streaky redness that is considered to be the issue. We will come back to all of this in more technical detail as I show you how Midrash Halacha handles it when we get to our commentary. But let's continue with how the priest handles it. Verse 50. And the priest, after examining the affection, shall isolate the affected article for 7 days. On the 7th day, he shall examine the affection. If the affection has spread in the cloth, whether in the warp or the woof or in the skin, for whatever purpose the skin may be used, the affection is a malignant eruption. It is unclean. And again, the phrase that's being used here for malignant is our tzara'at, that this is a leprous, if you wanted to use that old translation. And it is now tameh. It is ritually impure. Important to remember, we are only talking about ritual purity in all of this discussion. We are not talking about any other meaning of the word unclean that's being observed. And again, if it has not changed at all, meaning it hasn't gotten better and it hasn't spread, even if it hasn't, and it is destroyed. There is no way to repurify for a portion the concept that it is only tameh once it has been a proper kohen after the proper procedure. And that means anything it came into contact with prior to that declaration is not ritually unclean, only if something were to come into contact with it after that declaration. Verse 56, and don't worry, we'll have a chance to go back and review this. I just want to finish the version of what we do. But if the priest sees that the affected part after it has been washed is faded, he shall tear it out from the cloth or skin, whether in the warp or in the woof. And if it occurs again in the cloth, whether in the warp or in the woof or in any article of skin, it is a wild growth, and the affected article shall be consumed in fire. So if it's beginning to go away, then you can tear out the part that actually has it, and the rest of the article can be saved. Only the part that still shows a sign is destroyed. However, if it comes back again in that same item, then it is something that is spontaneously generating, and therefore the entire item is destroyed. Last two verses, 58. If, however, the affection disappears from the cloth, warp or woof, or from any article of skin that has been washed, it shall be washed again, and it shall be clean. So if it showed up and they put it in isolation, and it's still there, and then they wash it and wait another 7 days, and now it's gone, then you wash it again, and boom, you are perfectly willing, or you should be perfectly willing to use that item again. It is not tameh, it is not ritually impure, and therefore can cause no problems. Summary 59, such is the procedure for eruptive affections of cloth, tzara'at again, wool or linen, in a warp or in a woof, or in any article of skin, pronouncing it clean or unclean. Now, before we get into the commentary on all of this, just one last little observation, and then I will open it up for questions and general comments, which is to say that you will notice that verse 59 ends with the reminder that it is the Kohen's job to decide if it is clean or unclean, rather than simply saying, oh, let's just err on the side of caution. If you bring it in and it looks suspicious, we'll just burn it. They instead have an entire procedure that can result in the item being considered perfectly fine and therefore tahor, clean. It is not about erring on the side of caution. It is not always saying that we're going to be strict. It is saying the right thing to do is to follow the process and see where it leads you. If it leads you to the necessary destruction, so be it. If it leads you to the saying that the article is fine, so be it as well. The correct answer, tameh or tahor, impure or pure, is the right answer. The strict answer and the lenient answer don't get any bonus points just because you may like one or the other. Now, with that as my last commentary, before we get to our source sheet, I'll throw it open for additional comments or questions for this section of chapter 13. My guess is there might not be as many as usual because this
I have a question.
Up as much. Yes, go ahead.
Wait, did you hear me?
I did, yes, go ahead.
Okay. This piece of cloth, does that mean that the person was wearing it, or the person, is it associated with the person having this affliction, or is it just like a random piece of cloth notice that's in your house, or a part of a wall, or a utensil, or?
So we don't see anything about.
Is it associated with a human being afflicted?
No. So we don't see any description of like a wooden spoon or something, but both with regards to fabric as well as with regards to the house, which comes in a later portion, it is something that is spontaneous. It does not mean that it's in the house or in the wardrobe of somebody that had this problem. It's not saying if you are a Metzora, if you are a person with Tzara'at, then you have to watch your clothes more carefully. It's saying all of us have to watch our clothes. All of us have to watch our walls. All of us have to watch our skin. There's no expectation that it will only occur in the house of a person who is suffering from Tzara'at, which again is why we shouldn't be inclined to view this as being a very different kind of phenomenon than what we are used to dealing with. All right, any other questions or comments? Okay, then let's jump in to how our tradition tries to wrestle with this. And by tradition, I mean, we're going old school. As you all know, from time to time, I like to bring you up to speed with Midrash Halacha, which is the oldest layer of analysis, which sees as its primary purpose a close reading of the text in order to derive halachic conclusions, that is to say, legal interpretation. Just as a reminder, when the rabbis are engaging in this level of interpretation, they do not consider it to be interpretation in the broadest sense. They consider it to be a clarification of application. Moderns may consider this to be interpretive, and we can have that conversation some other time. But the rabbis saw themselves as reading the careful wording and construction of these verses, together with the rest of the Torah, as a strict analysis of understanding precisely what God meant by these verses and how that should be applied in Jewish law. So people who often ask me, well, why did the rabbis say X in the Mishnah or in the Talmud? Usually you have to go back to Midrash Halacha, to this earlier phrase or earlier phase of analysis to see the origin of much of Jewish law. However, it's not normally very exciting, and it also has its own particular style of conversational tone, and thus it remains often opaque to many readers. So from time to time, I do like to clarify a little bit, help you get a feel for it, and if that can inspire you to read the originals on your own, then I'm even happier. But for people who keep asking me, well, how do the rabbis know this? It's based off these types of analysis. So from our original verse, we're going to look at initially at the phrase and the garment. Now, you may be thinking, but wait a minute, Rabbi Neely, in verse 47, it doesn't say garment, it says fabric. Well, in the English, it says fabric. However, in the Hebrew, it says the word garment 3 times. And that is because the word for garment here is beged, which is still the modern Hebrew word for clothes. But the writer, probably a little bit less familiar with Jewish law, decided that what was really being discussed here was the material itself. But as we're going to see, the usage of the word beged, the usage of the word clothing, as opposed to the word cloth, is going to be instrumental in understanding this phenomenon. So with that in mind, what happens when we analyze the word garment or clothing? I might think, now that is a very common traditional opening sentence for Midrash Halacha, which is basically introducing you to a wrong hypothesis that because of the word or the way that the phrase was made is ruled out. This is saying, if you were just reading it casually and this word had not been there, you might have thought the following conclusion, but you'd be wrong. However, the word is there, and that's why you're wrong. So let's go ahead and see how this works in practice. I might think that this, meaning the whole concept of the tzara'at in clothing, includes remnants and cardings and coarse silk and cotton and camel wool and rabbit wool and goat down, basically all the other things that a person might use to make clothing. Therefore, it is therefore written in a garment of wool or in a garment of flax. So the first thing that rules out is the remnants and cardings, the extra little bits. Nope, it's got to be a garment. And it has to be one made of wool or of flax, that those are narrowing constraints, not examples. It's not if it's made of wool or flax or something else, but if it's made of wool or flax, done. And you may have noticed that those terms got repeated a lot, as did the description of the warp and the woof and the skin throughout the verses. This is a strong re-emphasis throughout this section. So, first thing we have to know is this is not talking about a roll of cloth that is sitting on your shelf. This is talking about a garment. And this is not talking about a roll of cloth, or a garment rather, that is made out of rabbit wool. This is talking about one made of wool, meaning from a sheep, or of flax. Flax in the modern world is called linen. Not as popular as it used to be because it's a real pain to keep ironed. Questions or comments before we move on to the next observation?
Rabbi,
Yes.
an observation. We read some time ago about the priestly garments.
Yes.
These are the 2 materials used for the priestly garments.
They are indeed. These are the 2 materials used for the priestly garments. They're also the 2 materials that cannot be mixed together, which makes shatnez, which is a forbidden mixture of cloth that cannot be used in a garment. So wool and flax were the 2 primary forms of cloth used in the ancient world, being the 2 most abundant, and they get special treatment throughout the Torah, both in their combination uniquely for the priestly garments and in their separation for the rest of us in all of our other garments. So indeed, wool and flax have a special place of primacy in the fabrics of the Torah. So part 3 of this section, I guess I didn't mention, this all comes from the collection of Midrashim known as Sifra. which is a verse-by-verse analysis. And as usual, you can go to Sefaria and find a decent translation. Still helps if you know a little bit of the Hebrew, but it's a pretty good translation nonetheless, although the terminology may still be confusing, which is why I'm trying to help. So the part 3 of this section of Sifra, I might think, again, as soon as you hear those words in Hebrew, Yachol, it means that whatever is about to come will be proved wrong. I might think that they, the garments, are subject to tumah, ritual impurity, whether dyed or not dyed. That is to say, whether it has been colored or not colored. It is therefore written in a garment of wool or in a garment of flax. What does that teach us? Just as flax is in its original state, which is implied by the fact that it is not the practice to dye flax, so for this plague spot uncleanliness, we require wool in its original state as well. So this is a deductive bit of information of why I keep mentioning garment of wool and garment of flax, because we can learn something about the wool by what we already know about the flax. Flax is linen, and linen, in the ancient world at least, and for the people who would have first received the Torah, was used as linen came, which is a white, slightly off-white color. Therefore, if the garment of flax is to be treated the same as the garment of wool, then the garment of wool should be treated the same as the garment of flax. Flax isn't dyed, therefore the wool can't be dyed either. Which is to mean if the wool is dyed, then it is not susceptible to tzara'at at all, meaning that any discoloration or other appearance of irregularities in it that might otherwise seem to indicate that you should be going to the Kohen, if that wool was dyed, you do not need to concern yourself. This is not tzara'at. There's probably some other issue that you might want to take care of, whether it be something staining it or some other form of a possible health concern. You know, you're letting your iron drip rust on it or something, but it is not tzara'at. Verse 4. I would exclude what is dyed by the hands of man, meaning, okay, fine, maybe dyeing is not allowed, but I would not exclude what is dyed by the hands of heaven, meaning, well, what if it was colored, not because I did it, but because somehow nature conspired to end up causing dye to be embedded in this cloth. However, it is therefore written of flax and of wool. Just as flax is white, so wool must be white, meaning to be subject to this plague spot uncleanliness, to the tzara'at. Meaning that you might think, well, what happens if I have a black sheep? And that means the wool is black. And so therefore I am pre-dyeing the wool by choosing the wool from a black sheep. Again, just as flax is white, so too the wool, to be susceptible to this, must also be white. And if you happen to have a brown sheep and you make a brown jacket out of it, it is not going to be susceptible to tzara'at. And again, not susceptible is not telling you that there will not be unusual spots or discoloration. Not susceptible means any spots or discoloration that you happen to see cannot be considered as coming from tzara'at. That cannot be their origin, because otherwise the Torah would have been written differently to tell us that wool behaves differently than flax. Everyone following the logic so far? Again, I'm not trying to convince you of the perfection of their logic. That is far beyond my ability to do so. You either accept the interpretations of the sages or you don't. Although we can talk about that perhaps more in a relaxed manner other times, but helping you to see the steps that they take to move from the text of the Torah to an understanding of how to apply it in the real world. Section 7. I might think, again, trigger word, if it says that, I know what's coming is going to be wrong. I just have to figure out why. I might think that they are subject to tumah immediately. That is to say, as soon as the wool and flax have been gathered, i.e., even before they are fully processed. meaning before the wool and fabric has been turned into something. It is therefore written garment, beged. Just as garment connotes complete processing, so all, warp and woof, must be completely processed. What is their complete processing? What does that mean? The warp when it is boiled, the woof at once, and the bundles of flax when they are whitened. So these are the words of Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda clarifies for us that if the warp has been boiled, and that is to say, prepared for its use on the loom, then if it appears just in that, then yes, you do need to be considered that this might be a eruption of tzara'at. If it has not yet been boiled and the coloration still appears, you can be assured that it is not from tzara'at. And likewise, the other things have similar vulnerabilities only when they have reached a certain state of preparedness. I might think, again, I'm going to be wrong, just I have to figure out why, that any size is subject to tumah, meaning any size piece of cloth or garment. It is therefore written garments, just as something is not called a garment unless there is a weaving of warp and a woof the size of 3 fingers by 3 fingers, which is about like that versus that, so about a 3-inch square. So all pieces of cloth, even if there were enough thread in the coil to make the entire warp and the entire woof, meaning you need to have that minimum. If the coil consists of separate threads, it is not subject to tzara'at tuma, to this type of impurity. Rabbi Yehuda says, if there was even one separation in the entire coil and he tied it, it is not subject to tzara'at tuma, to this type of impurity. Now, that's probably more technical information than you wanted to ever know about how to make cloth and thread and weave. But what they are trying to point out here is that the requirements to be susceptible to this particular issue are very strict. And not every thread, not every cloth, not every garment is going to fall into this category. And therefore, it is severely limiting the places where it can appear. However, by severely limiting the places where it can appear, you may be beginning to realize that this is not just a regular condition. Hopefully you're noticing a running theme of today's conversation. After all, if this was a purely biological or natural phenomenon, then there would be no reason to expect it to behave differently in black wool or white wool, or whether it's 3 inches or less than 3 inches, or any of the other conditions that we've seen. And if you go to Sifra, by the way, you will see that I've only brought a handful of the deductions because we only have a certain amount of time each day. But there are numerous conditions that narrow where this might occur that have nothing to do with the natural properties of the materials in which it might occur. So that should be giving you pause to reconsider this as a natural phenomenon, and hopefully it will then make you understand why the rest of our commentary is going to work very hard to elevate this away from any suspicion that this might be a normal natural process. Any questions on Sifra and the ones that I've brought before we move on to some interpretations that are a bit more general, not as narrowly focused? Okay, so let's move down to some Midrash, this time taken from Tanhuma as translated by Buber. It is difficult for the Holy One to reach out his hand against a human being. Pause real quick before people go crazy trying to say, oh, but how can you say something's difficult for God? Please, this is a different form of the word difficult than perhaps you are used to. This is not talking about the challenge that it presents to God's power. This is talking about the challenge that it presents to God's will. God doesn't want to do something against a person. God does not want to hurt people. God does not want to punish people. God would much rather avoid that. Therefore, it's difficult for God to do that. Again, it's not talking about a limitation on God's power. It's talking about a beautiful part of God's nature, that God would just as rather not punish, hurt, or in any way cause discomfort to a person. Rather, rather than just reaching out and smacking instantly, he forewarns a person and afflicts his house, as stated, and when I put a plague of tzara'at in a house of the land you possesses. If he repents, fine. So if there is a problem in the house and the person has it taken care of and they recognize that this might have been brought about by their behaviors, then good, everything goes back to normal, nothing else is needed. But if not, then it afflicted his clothes, as stated, when the plague of tzara'at is in his garment. If he repents, meaning now that it's gone from his house and it's also showing up in his clothing, okay, fine. But if not, then it comes upon his body. As it is stated, when anyone has on his skin of his flesh a swelling, a sore, or a bright spot. So what the Tanhuma Midrash is trying to tell us here is that although there is no necessary linkage between the three different varieties of tzara'at that are covered in the Torah, and that we should not see them as being an infection spreading from one to the other, there is nonetheless a chain of events that can explain why all three might appear. But it's not one infected the other. It was you missed the first warning, you missed the second warning, and you are now dealing with the third warning, the third consequence. And if you continue to be pig-headed, then this is going to continue. This is way of God gently escalating his rebuke, his showing of displeasure at something that is occurring by beginning as far from the person himself and then moving closer and closer only due to their continued stubbornness in persisting in whatever immorality it is that they are engaged in. And in a similar variety, Sefer HaChinuch summarizes it thusly. It is from the roots of the commandment that God wanted in his great goodness to chasten us, to tell us when we're wrong, like a man chasten his child. Meaning that when you are giving discipline to a child, you don't start by hitting them with all of your force, God forbid, but that you gently work your way up with stronger and stronger punishments until the child understands that what they are doing is wrong. As this matter is not natural, but rather a sign with the holy people, in order that they learn and take rebuke, take this criticism in the changing of items that are particularly for their use. And they are clothes of wool and flax, as most usage of people is with them. And they repent through this from their evil way before tzara'at breaks out also in their bodies. All right, questions or comments before we move on to a longer discussion of this point?
Rabbi, looking at Buber specifically,
yes.
How I've been looking at this is just as there are various levels of heaven or coverings leading up to the throne of the Holy One, so too there are levels of covering to each soul, from our skin to our garments to our dwellings, that so we have these levels of covering to the soul, and so each one is afflicted in a different way, but in each case it's supposed to be a prompt to repent, to somehow change what you're doing, your relationship, either with the material, your stuff, because we certainly have human nature, as we certainly do like our stuff sometimes, but also with each other.
Very true. And those wrappers are indeed starting from as far from the person directly as possible, and then moving into more intimate levels of contact with who we are. For those that would like more information about the causes, the type of sins that might have led to tzara'at, please go back and watch some of my older classes, or just look up the PDFs in the Dropbox on these topics. But one of the things that hopefully you'll now realize by the time we have reached the end of this first page is this isn't natural. And that means that when there is a natural illness or problem, we should not interpret it as being the same reason or the same cause as these. If it is tzara'at, that is to say, this unique form of problem, then yes, a person should interpret that as being rebuke, as being criticism, as being a divine indication that there needs to be a change in their behavior in life. But if it is not tzara'at, meaning it's regular old leprosy or some other problem in your house and garments, you do not need to interpret it as though God were afflicting you. You do not need to see this as though you are being punished for some transgression or warned against a transgression. Instead, sometimes bodies break, houses have problems. Those are not considered to be punishments, but are just part of living in a material, fragile world. And with that distinction between natural and supernatural, I want to turn to Ramban and his interpretation of how this works and where it works. So he begins by reminding us, as hopefully you've now gotten thoroughly drummed into you, this is not the natural order of things. Tzara'at does not behave like a natural thing, nor does it ever happen in the world outside of Israel, meaning this is only an issue within Israel itself, and indeed in a longer commentary, and both by him as others, it was only during the days of when the temple stood. So even in the modern world, modern state of Israel, Medinat Yisrael, celebrating its birthday tomorrow, yay, we do not have to concern ourselves with tzara'at. And similarly, the tzara'at of houses. But when Israel is wholly devoted to God, then his spirit is upon them always to maintain their bodies, clothes, and houses in a good appearance. Thus, as soon as one of them commits a sin or transgression, a deformity appears in his flesh or in his garment or in his house, revealing that God has turned aside from him. So notice, first of all, that what he is interpreting here is that tzara'at only happens when all of Israel is devoted to God and all of us are at that highest level of attachment to God, such that our very selves are being taken care of, even in their physical form, by God's intimate connection, which means that when we make a mistake, it becomes readily apparent. This is not saying that only the worst of the worst gets tzara'at. This is saying instead, only the best of the best are even likely to, because without that level of connection, this type of expression of current problem wouldn't even be possible. Everyone hopefully understands what he's saying there. So it is for this reason that the Torah states, "And I shall put the plague of tzara'at in the house of the land of your possession," meaning that it is God's punishment upon that house. Thus, it applies only in the land which is the inheritance of the eternal, even as he said, "When you are coming into the land of Canaan, which I give to you for a possession." The land of your possession, going into the land of possession, that is where tzara'at in the house can occur. And indeed, the rest of the halacha points out that tzara'at was not possible in the wilderness of Sinai, that during that time, those 40 years, tzara'at was not a concern. Now, the reason why this law does not apply outside of the land of Israel is not because it is a duty which attaches to the ground. It's not something magical in the dirt of Israel, but the reason is because this matter occurs only in the chosen land wherein the glorious name dwells. It's because of God's close association with Israel at the peak moments of our nation's spiritual health that we then become susceptible. And in the Torat Kohanim, which is the other term for Sifra, the Midrash collection that we read from at the beginning, the sages further interpreted that a house does not contract impurity until after the conquest and division, and until after each and every individual clearly knows his portion. So this is a section that I didn't bring because it's already mentioned here in his commentary. But as he is saying, that problem of tzara'at won't happen until we are all there, settled, and have been given the apportioned lot during the days of Joshua. The reason for this is that the law is only then do they have the ease of mind to know the eternal, and the divine glory dwells among them. Meaning that while we were still in conquering mode, fighting mode, anxiety mode, that we are under the threat of attack by our neighbors, you can't fully detach yourself from those normal concerns and very reasonable concerns and allow yourself to attach yourself more wholly to God. Instead, there is always a tension between the needs of the moment and the spiritual call. Once we are at peace, then we could be in that true state of perfect attachment described at the beginning of his commentary, and thus receive the benefits which, when they are taken away, will result in the appearance of tzara'at in its different varieties. Okay. For this reason also, I think similarly with the reference to the law of tzara'at in garments, that it applies only in the land. For this reason also, the law of tzara'at in garments applies only to white garments, not to colored ones, because the color might perhaps have extracted this unclean phenomenon in that place in a natural way, and it will then not be regarded as a finger of God, meaning that the affliction had to come in the uncolored garments, because any other garment, had it had this affliction, you might have attributed the discoloration to a natural means. The only way that this works as a reminder, as a rebuke, as a way of teaching the people, is if it is exhibiting phenomenon and criteria, meeting criteria that make it completely impossible to describe as a natural phenomenon. And thus, all the conditions that we looked at the beginning are there not to limit the power or limit, how it will appear, but to make sure that when it does appear, there is no doubt that this is the hand of God. Therefore, garments colored by heaven, meaning the color is natural, can contract impurity according to the words of Rabbi Shimon, and by way of the simple meaning of the Torah. And the reason why it repeats in every verse the expression, the garment or the skin or the warp or the woof, is because the matter is miraculous. If it's not miraculous, and that is to say, if you can tell that it is not a miracle that you have this problem, then it is just a regular problem. If it is only by a miracle that it can be explained, then indeed one should very much examine what might have caused this to occur. Questions or comments on Ramban's interpretation? A reminder, since we haven't used Ramban a lot because he tends to be rather long in his explanations, Ramban is also known as Nachmanides, and if you would like to read more of his work, I highly recommend it. But like I said, his commentary does tend to have more words, which usually is a good thing, because the more words usually means the more clarity. But depending upon your schedule, you may, and also your needs, you may want to stick with Rashi and some of the others for the time being.
I have a question about Ramban, his observation that only occurs in white cloth or white garments. White garments, if fill me in, I know white garments are worn by litigants in court, correct?
Well, white was worn by everyone most of the time. That was
but there were certain times when it would be worn. Am I correct in that understanding or not?
Well, yes. I mean, for example, we still wear white before on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Some will also wear white during the celebration of Pesach. But the concept is, yes, to appear as blameless, to appear as one that is wishing to be blameless.
So this would be, I mean, in practical terms, one pulls out their white garments for a holiday or for a court appearance, and there it is.
That is certainly possible. But I think that we should remember that most people had one set of clothing. They didn't have their Sunday best. They just had what they wore. And that most of the clothes that they had, even if they had more than one set of clothes, would generally be white as well. A little extra color here and there. Yes, if you were very successful and prosperous, you might be able to afford some additional dye. But most of what people were wearing was white, and then dirty white by default.
Okay, thank you.
All right, let us read our final interpretation from Sifra to show you that it is not only about technicalities, but that it has some very important insights that help us understand the emotion and spirituality of this as well. So if they, meaning these rules, have been stated in relation to the first week, why need they be restated in relation to the second week? And this is talking about the rules of a human who is under observation. Let it simply be written, and the Kohen shall see it on the seventh day again, and he shall declare him clean. Because if a plague spot in a garment remains unchanged the first week, the garment is quarantined. And if it remains unchanged the second week, it is burned, as we saw. But if a plague spot in a man, in a human being, remains unchanged the first week, he is quarantined. And if it remains unchanged the second week, he is declared tahor. He is rendered ritually pure under those circumstances. And you can go back to the beginning of chapter 13 for more on that. And if this were not clearly spelled out in 13:6, we would say that just as a garment in those circumstances is burned at the end of the second week, so a person in those circumstances is to be declared tameh at the end of the second week, or, God forbid, should be burned. It must therefore be spelled out in both the first week and the second week. It is not for nothing that there are differences between how tzara'at is handled for a person and how it is handled for items. Yes, it may seem repetitive and sometimes going on over and over the same phrases in a way that you might have guessed could have been summarized, but the rules differ between humans and items because humans are different than things. And an item may now be declared impure, but a human being may be declared pure. And an item may be destroyed, but we don't do that with a human. Just as you may have thought that since this on a person in particular shows that they are worthy of this sin, if it is this supernatural, miraculous affliction that is on a person, you might be tempted to say, look, the hand of God has struck this person with tzara'at, therefore clearly God is opposed to them. Why should we have anything to do with them? Why should we even let them live? Let us burn them out of our midst. And no, that is not how Torah tells us to behave. Even to somebody under the circumstances that we have examined today that is suffering from a clearly miraculous affliction because of their deviation from the closeness with God. Even a person like that still deserves observation, treatment, and care, especially if it turns out to be a natural affliction. But even if it turns out to be a miraculous punishment, they still have to be treated differently than the way we would treat your shirt that has this affliction. That is an incredibly important reminder that Torah makes in many other ways as well, that we treat people differently than we treat things. And when we start treating people like things, if we pretend like there is no difference between them, or if we just can't be bothered to notice that there is a difference of how the Torah calls us to treat them differently, then we end up with a world that is indeed very far from God. Questions, comments, or additional observations that people would like to share? All right. Thank you all very much. Once again, remember that today is Yom Hazikaron, the Remembrance Day for those who fell in Israel in defense of the land, whether in the field of battle or struck by terrorists. And tonight and tomorrow is the celebration of Yom Ha'atzmaut, of Israel's Independence Day. So let us remember those who have fallen, and let us rejoice with those who still stand, and hope to build an Israel that is able to have a lasting peace. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome.